This is Storyboard. Welcome. My name is Jameson Smith, and along with me today,
I'm Zach Brown.
And we wanted to introduce you to a new podcast that we are starting. One that's a little bit more intimate and a little bit more...
No intimacy here, man.
Oh, okay. We'll avoid... No. We wanted this to be a community-based creativity podcast. To let you know, this isn't starting a story from scratch. This is storyboarding out ideas that we have previously conceived.
Now, this is not to be confused with waterboarding. We're not here to torture you.
No, there is no torture going to happen to you today.
Maybe tomorrow.
Maybe.
So, what we're going to do is every other week, we're going to pilot this going. So Jameson will pilot one week, I'll pilot the next week. And we're just going to switch off doing some stories that are near and dear to our brains.
And hearts. I'm fairly attached to mine. I don't know about you.
No, I hate yours.
Oh.
That's why I agreed to do this with you.
Oh.
No.
You'd tear mine apart.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the community part of this is the fact that we're bringing different facets of our universes to you to fill your ears and let you enjoy the universes we've created, but also to bring up certain aspects of our stories and have you guys help us to brainstorm different backstories and different things that deepen our universes.
So how you can do this is send in questions. If you have questions about anything that we talk about at all, send them to us. And you might get your question read on air.
Yeah, and that helps us to be a little bit more creative thinking, creative minded, and be able to think about all the things that we need to do to deepen even further our universes.
So the really, really cool thing that we are most excited for about this with this podcast is not only are we going to be storyboarding this and telling you a bit about the universe as we go along, but at the end of every single podcast, we're actually going to be reading stuff that we have written in these universes, telling the actual story of what happens in a more professional format.
Yes, you guys will get to hear exactly what we've written and get to know the characters and everything in our universe even better. Not just the characters, but places, people that are random, every facet, basically.
Heck, if you have questions about how they can grow facial hair, we'll answer it.
The thing is we're going to have the final say on yes or no if these are used. So if you have a really good idea, we'll acknowledge you for it, but we'll have to change it for our own so it's not copywriting your ideas, not completely taking it. We'll be inspired off of you guys. And we also want to say, yes, you guys are awesome. We love your ideas, and we want to build off of it. And keep in mind that these universes are pre-created as well, so they're fairly deep as is. We're just having you help us to expand them.
And so later on, I mean, we have big plans for this. We want you guys to maybe even, I mean, this is way later on, and we'll have more details forthcoming, but maybe one of you will actually get featured in our story. Maybe you'll have a character in the story that you can sort of help us create. Keep in mind, like Jameson was saying, the final say is ours, but they could have your name. So, faithful listeners and faithful listeners to be, keep that in mind.
We're so happy to get this started, and it's going to be a long-term podcast, we hope. If a story is brought to completion, we can start on a sequel, or we can bring on new people with new stories that they have made.
So just an exciting thing. We're very eager and ready to do this. My body is Reggie.
My body is Reggie.
And we hope you enjoy Storyboards.
Today on Storyboards, we're going to start with my story. My story I came up with a long time ago. It was actually a dream I had. And if you know me, I have very deep, detailed dreams, and I've learned to kind of control my dreams and take them into interesting places and let my mind kind of show me things. It's really neat.
Sort of a fun little fact. Not only is Jameson's story based on a dream that he had, my story is based off of a dream that I had.
So they're kind of dream stories. We could call this dream boards or story dreams.
Or maybe we should just stick with Storyboards.
That works too.
I like that
I
name.
like that too. Today, we're going to discuss Eternity Found. Eternity Found is a space epic. It is... Originally, I thought of it as a space odyssey kind of a thing, but it's grown and changed in my mind. And today, I want to just discuss the universe of Eternity Found.
What universe? Where is this universe? How is this universe?
Now, originally, I had designed this universe to be a future of our own galaxy, but in further experimentation with the story, I felt the situation worked better if it was without our timeline, if it was without the Earth existing, if it was someplace far away that was just totally separate. I'm not saying it's Star Wars separate long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, because that can be considered actually somewhat related to our universe.
Yeah, that implies that our galaxy exists.
Yeah, this is a complete fantasy space epic.
It's got big old castles flying in space, and it's a fantasy space epic.
Not quite like that.
Oh.
But it does have some Arthurian influence. There will be some terms that you recognize that would be from our history, but to them, it's something entirely different.
So this universe is really, really cool. I remember when Jameson first started to tell me about it, I was immediately intrigued. It's got everything you could imagine. I mean, it's got everything from aliens to reality TV shows about aliens that are still stuck in medieval societies that have 4 arms. It's got cryo dolls, which we'll talk about a bit. It's got almost a superhero aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's got it all. So
I wanted to throw a little spice of everything, basically, into it.
Little bit of pepper, little bit of garlic.
I want it to feel swashbuckling, so I added very close and personal action-based combat that, makes you feel for each character involved. And so some of the technology in this is very intimately used with, they still sometimes use swords and shields, but can have guns and lasers and all those kinds of things. But it's a very grounded sort of fantasy as well. So there's kind of a science, kind of a organization to the madness of it all.
Even though it's still got the swords and things, I mean, you still got spaceship combat. And the spaceships are not wielding giant swords. What do you think this is, Voltron?
No, it's not quite like that. Just to give a little background or history to the universe, imagine this wide galaxy with many, many different systems within it. Solar systems, stars with small asteroids, and many of these planets are populated with people, humans, aliens of multiple different kinds. You have lizard people, you have bird people, you can have just a wide variety of things. I've included things that are kind of a space twist of fantasy creatures like gnomes or giants or things like that.
Like we said before, things with 4 arms.
Things with 4 arms. Space Cthulhu.
Yes, Space Cthulhu. Space Cthulhu, that's a chef and very pacifistic Space Cthulhu.
We'll get to meet him later on. He is actually a very main character. Not the very main character, but
he's
main
part
character.
of the supporting cast.
He's the supporting cast. But this universe began very young, where one solar system was able to advance its technology enough to be able to search out space in a fast enough manner to reach each planet to meet people. These societies were able to build launch gates, basically, where they could dock their ships and it would send their ships faster than their engines could propel them.
Now, we are going to do a little bit of pseudoscience in our things. Don't ask, so is this done by electromagnetics and a vacuum? How much energy does this take? I didn't design this ship. Did you design?
Yeah, if you know that there might be a pseudo-science that could explain this phenomenon,
please feel free to let us know,
Yeah,
and we'd be happy to
let us fill it in for us.
We'd be happy to say that was our original idea.
Any scientific explanation that could help us out would be amazing, and it would help to fill in the gaps that we couldn't provide.
So this civilization, this society that was able to go out and about and start exploring, did so and found that they were not the only society.
No. They used the launch gates to bridge the dead space between solar systems.
I mean, the size of a universe is infinite.
As they met with each planet, they were able to communicate to create a council. They were able to grab representatives from each of these species that they met to meet together and discuss how they would now act now that they are connected in a way, in a form of travel and a form of communication, that their universes, their solar systems are now combined. Now, this would take a long, long time for these many, many systems to connect and create. But along their journey, they met with a race of robotic aliens called the Tailings. These aliens are a little bit unknown to them at this point. They're a mystery, but they're very benevolent. They came in and offered knowledge and technology. They took these launch gates and updated them with their own systems, where instead of creating a faster way of traveling that still took years of travel, it was faster than light travel that was near instantaneous. It connected the galaxies even faster, allowed these people to travel even further, even faster.
All hail the robotic overlords.
As they spread out and created a larger economy, they had to figure out a law by which that they would be governed. And so, with all the representatives that they gathered, all this different species that they were able to convince to join in a political aspect, they created a court. And they called this the Court of the Constellations.
They got together and they created intergalactic law. Tried to enforce it in many different ways.
Yes. Now, they found that it was more difficult for some of these representatives to travel from home to the court and be able to attend every meeting, to be able to know what law was passed and what was created. And so many of the representatives found comfort in the main constellation that began this whole event. This constellation kind of makes up the shape, if you connect the dots like you would a constellation, creates a crown. And that's why they call this the Court of the Constellations. It's kind of a kingdom ruled with democracy, as a galactic republic.
Just as a clarification, not all alien races are present in the court.
No. There are many that denied to join them, and actually some that were violent against them, as you would expect in a universe as large as this.
I mean, we can't have peace on Earth. Can we have peace in a universe?
And they found with the vast number of planets that didn't obey the galactic law, they found that enforcing the law was extremely difficult. And that made that anybody who joined the court's enforcement group, as they call them, the courtmen, they found it less of a power than the forces fighting against them. And they struggled. This creates a universe that is both dangerous in the law, being so thin and spread out that they will act a little bit more rash and violently towards crime than would a very full and actually
a good system
of law. Crime is abundant, and it can't be fully contained and controlled.
And so the Court of Constellations, with being stretched so immensely thin, decided they needed help. They needed help to enforce the peace, to enforce the laws. And so they turned to a specific place.
First off, they actually turned to the Tailings, the race of robotic beings that originally helped them to reach these constellations. They found out that the Tailings are a very neutral race. They do not like to provide one race with the means over another. Like, if there were a war to erupt, they wouldn't disallow any army from using their launching gates. It would have to be their decision or their efforts, that species' own efforts in guarding the gate. They're a very non-intrusive society. And the Court of Constellations wanted to give back to the Tailings for the amount of things that they were given. And so they allowed the Tailings to choose sectors of space that they could claim as their own. And it took years, thousands of years, for them to select all the provinces in space that they would claim as their own.
Now, the cool thing I really enjoy about the Tailings is it's not just like, okay, sector of space, it's this planet, this moon. They're like, no, I want this void right here. There's nothing here. I'm going to make it my own.
Mm-hmm.
And so they like create this almost an air bubble thing that goes around, and they can like swim through space. It's so cool.
Yeah, they create a bubble, an area, a space surrounded by a container, which they fill with their own chemicals and fluids that would allow a physical being, somebody like you and I, a biological being, to be able to breathe in space, because these chemicals allowed enough oxygen to go through our body. Now imagine this, you could just leave your atmosphere and just go swimming through space. Of course, you would get exhausted and probably die of starvation and thirst before.
We don't talk about that.
You still need modes of transportation because it's still a distance. But this allows that the Tailings wouldn't have to use crewed ships to travel. They can just fly to and from with their own engines.
I mean, they are robots. They don't really need food.
Some of these spaces, some of these voids did include minor stars and some planets. And there were very small groups of people that rebelled against it and fought against them. But that is a topic for another time.
If you have questions on it, send them in.
The Tailings didn't want to help with the intergalactic law enforcement, and so they were forced to look for other alternatives. Now, another group arose from the ingenuity of these constellations and created a industry or a faction called Avalon.
Like the big tree.
Like the big tree.
Hence the Arthurian reference we said earlier.
Now, Avalon is very integral to the story, and we'll touch on it more at a later time.
So, Avalon becomes the intergalactic policing force. They're basically hired out to go to a planet and provide all of the police work for that planet, enforce all the laws on that planet, and say no to anybody who would break any of these laws. And those laws can be as simple as you can't hunt anything, to as complex as if you do this one specific thing in this one specific place, that's against the specific law, and sorry, you're going to die.
It became a very cruel way of enforcement. But the constellations, the court of the constellations, didn't have much of a greater choice. But Avalon was not always as cruel and as powerful as this. There was a time when they were more benevolent, more like the Tailings. In fact, they were co-founded by the Tailings in another means of technology sharing. There was a man who started this to be a more charitable business, where by the donations of money and people from various planets, hoping to gain balance in the universe, they would provide protection. But eventually, because of some circumstances, this business became corrupted and became as we described.
So, I mean, it was great beforehand. That benevolence was wonderful. But now they're going to places and saying, okay, we're going to be enforcing law here. We're taking you, and you. You don't have a choice. We're taking you. You're going to be a part of our organization, whether you like it or not. If you don't, we'll probably kill your family. So there's just a lot of shady things going on there.
But at the same time, they have the political power to convince people that they're the right choice, that they're the good of the universe.
So, good old morally ambiguous grounds. Gotta love them.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about a couple of the major big factions in this universe, just as good base of operations and things. Do you want to talk a bit about cryodolls? Or shall we leave that?
We leave that as a mystery for now.
Okay, those are fun. I think you guys will like those. I really like them.
Keep in your minds now what the universe I've described to you is like, and what the factions are like. And next time we discuss this, you'll get to learn a little bit more about how the universe runs itself. The cryodolls, as previously stated, is just part of the commerce in this universe.
It's a wonderful commerce. I love trading people. Oh, sorry. We're not talking about that. There you have it. The base of eternity found. The universe itself. We will go into extreme depth. So we're going to plan on talking about individual planets to individual people to, if you guys want to know a lot more about this one specific thing, maybe it's Avalon Industries, maybe it's the Court of Constellations, we'll go into those things. So
we can detail people, the people involved in starting it. We can detail the exact Tailings who came and met with them, who gave them the technology, what kind of technology it was, along with the different planets that they first met.
We can talk about Toddley.
Toddley.
Good old Toddley Ron turn.
Now, this section of the podcast would be where we discussed the questions that were sent in to us, and we'd add it onto the story, and we'd kind of create a bit more. We'd brainstorm a bit and just figure out how to deepen the backstory, along with your guys' questions and comments.
We would, we'll have questions in front of us, ones that you guys sent in, and they can, let's do an example. Hello, I'm a faithful listener. Ha ha.
Well, hello, faithful listener. What's your question?
So where did you come up with the name Eternity Found?
Now, listener, I'd like to explain to you that to go into full detail, the whole Eternity Found would spoil a lot of the story for you, but there's multiple meanings to the name itself. It was a perfect name. It was the project name that I gave it, but it stuck to me as the title of the book because it fits in so many facets. You'll learn soon why. Especially in this episode, there's a slight hint at it. But one of the meanings is the eternities of space. The eternities of meaning to space and life within it. And finding that eternity.
Thanks a bunch. Your name here.
Mm-hmm.
So we want this to be a community thing. We love these stories. We want you to love these stories. So we just want your questions.
We want to be able to explain this to you and get you excited to hear more about it. And we'll definitely have more ways for you guys to contribute at a later time. We just need more of you to be able to listen, pass it off to friends, let them listen, see if they're interested. Now, if they're not interested in my story, there will be another story that we discuss next week.
Which we're not going to mention anything else about.
Yes.
For now.
For now.
Completely different.
Completely, entirely different.
Like, different tones, different everything.
Not even the same genre.
No, not even close to the same genre.
So we'll leave that to next time. Now, this next section of the podcast, this episode's going to be a little bit shorter than what we plan on it being, because we're going to have your questions and comments added that pad the time a bit more. But this section is the most important section for us.
The most exciting section for us.
Because this is where we get to provide to you our work in detail in a more dramatic format.
So, I mean, I listen to audiobooks all the time. I love listening to audiobooks. I love being able to hear the author's words presented in a format like that. So, we're going to do it a little bit like that, but instead of hiring out someone to read a book, you're going to get the book read to you by the author themselves. So you're going to get intonations and things that from the characters that you just wouldn't get in another situation, an audiobook situation, because hardly any are read by the authors themselves.
Yeah.
So, plus, another really cool thing, you're going to get read Eternity Found not just by the author himself, but by a professional voice actor.
I am.
Which is
professional voice actor.
Really, really cool. You're going to get a lot better quality of stuff than when I read mine, probably.
He is a very talented actor as well.
Oh, wait. Tell me more.
I don't want to pad your ego that much.
Like the big planet? That you go?
No, not. Oh, I guess. I don't know. But even you'll get chapters of our books along with side stories that won't even be in the books. This is where you'll get exclusive content outside of what will be published eventually.
And so we're not going to go necessarily prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. We might go prologue, this cool random story, chapter 1, and cool random story is way in the future or way in the past.
Mm-hmm. So things like you'll get my prologue, and then suddenly you'll get maybe the meeting of the Talanks in the Court of Constellations.
Not saying that's what we'll do.
Not saying that's what we'll do. That's not the plan right now. But it could happen.
So, without further ado, we really just hope you enjoy this presentation of the prologue of Eternity Found.
Sweeping the floors and dusting the mantels was the average day for someone like Ethel. She was a maid in a wealthy household who lived day by day, working to earn the meals she can eat, which she also happened to cook. Most of the food that she was asked to make, she didn't entirely enjoy herself. She would catch herself staring out the higher windows to the distant mountains and hills. She would imagine of what kind of animals or views she could see from that side of the world. The passing carriages down below would carry along her mind to what their destinations might be. Ethel opened the door to her lady's master chamber, carrying the overly frilly dress to the wardrobe. She noticed the proud noblewoman sitting at a mirror, layering her face with exuberant amounts of makeup. Her posture was so practiced that it seemed almost to be her nature, just radiating the fact that she was higher class than most. Even her glowing white undergown would shout to the world of her better upbringing, if it weren't improper to be seen outside her room. "Your dress, milady," Ethel said as she lowered her hands to her lap and gave a small bow. She looked up enough to see the jewel-clad woman step up to her. "Ethel, you've been so good to us, and we haven't given you much in return. To live in your home and share a kitchen is plenty enough for me." Her vision wandered to the side as she felt her heart sink at the lie of her complacency. She knew that the sound of her voice couldn't convince a child, let alone the person who affords her livelihood. She was used to covering her own emotions and opinions with the proper responses. "Well, I want to give you more. Tonight I want you to join me at the gala. You can have your own dress and everything," the mistress announced with a broad smile. Ethel could see the earnestness in her mistress's eyes. The same familiar stare and smile could be seen when she had a pleasant date or when she was given something fanciful and new. "I don't want to sound ungrateful," her head lowered in doubt of herself as her voice continued. "But I don't know." Ethel turned around, feeling the shame in her mind. She didn't want a handout. She didn't want to just live like the lords and ladies that she served every day. It was all too familiar to her. Just experiencing the other side of the table and looking back isn't something that could excite her. "Don't be crazy. This is the biggest gala in town, and perhaps this country will ever see. People from all over Palantir will be there, bringing with them all sorts of foods and exotic things." Her mistress attempted to entice Ethel, as if she were another noblewoman from the courts, the promise of wonders and pleasures to be had just leaping from her demeanor. The imagery and thought of the possibilities to be had filled her head, as if it leaped through her throat from her quickening heart. This could very much be all she ever wanted. Her mind fought against the emotion, deeming the moment as a flight of fancy. She remained professional before her mistress. "It all sounds well, but it's just one night." Ethel was caught off guard by how close her mistress came, as if to whisper advice to a close friend. "One night might lead to a life of adventure. You never know if you might meet the right man at one of these things, who'll whisk you off to a greater life." She found herself blushing at the thought of finding love and adventure. She fought hard to keep a smile from admitting her full acceptance. Perhaps I will join you." She raised her eyes to see the prideful, brimming face before her. "It couldn't hurt for one night. Just to try." The mistress's smile grew even broader, and she gave Ethel a quick hug. The embrace caught Ethel off guard, making her lose herself in thought before naturally beginning to work again to avoid more awkwardness. The mistress slowly walked towards the changing room with her dress in hand. She turned back and looked at Ethel, concentrating on her work. She hugged the edge of the door excitedly and thought, as she whispered to herself, "You deserve this. Don't waste the opportunity to make more for yourself. You'd be the one out of the two of us, brave enough to even try. I know you'll love it." Ethel wiped off the face of the grandfather clock just out in the hallway, revealing a clean reflection of her face. She was caught off guard by the smile that seemed to stay lingering after their conversation. She shook herself awake and began cleaning again. She opened the clock and began cleaning the pieces within. The machinery could almost entrance her in the way that it moves, its ticking both keeping and telling the time. She had almost hoped that if she could move the clock forward, it would also send her to the future, where she was already enjoying the gala. She only worried of the chance that nothing would come of the event, and that tomorrow she would have to return to her regular life. Ethel walked into the large gala room, adorned with chandeliers of all types of glass. Her bright blue dress dragged lightly behind her, as the frills bounced with each nervous step. If her nervousness wouldn't kill her by night's end, then her feet would fall off with exhaustion at the work of balancing on the thin, pointed heels. The variety of people filling the room would baffle any average person. However, her mind was ready to learn all she could about each one of them. She walked sheepishly among the crowd that was chatting while others were swaying back and forth to the elegant music being played. Just watching the couples dance made her body begin to swing along with the music. She would dance, but she knew her unpracticed, clumsy feet would cause her to be the talk of the gala. The tables across the room were full of meats, vegetables, and creams that seemed too numerous and various to be from a single culture. She stepped to the food tables and was caught off guard by the wall of smells surrounding it. Her mouth began to water as she carefully reached down to the treats that she normally wouldn't be allowed to have. All of the new flavors before her threw her thoughts to the mountains that grew unique fruits, or the jungles where the strange creatures were hunted. The large, gold-trimmed windows behind the table showed the many carriages outside, awaiting their owners' commands. What places have they seen? Where will they go? "Excuse me, young lady." A man stepped up behind her, dressed in an elegant white suit, with a large, trimmed beard that covered a well-traveled face. He held his arms behind his back in the proper positioning for greeting a lady. She gasped slightly as she brought herself back into reality and quickly moved herself from his way to the table. "Pardon me, my lord." She gave a slight bow with her hands in the familiar place on her lap. He chuckled lightly as he brought his hand around to take hers politely. He lowered his face and kissed her fingers before stating, "You misunderstand. The only dessert I seek for is the pleasure of your acquaintance." He bent back downward to kiss her fingers again. Ethel wanted to pull her fingers away in embarrassment at the sudden approach. She looked to the side to catch the sight of her mistress goading her on with a little shoo of her hand and a bright smile of encouragement. Ethel's lips remained tight, as she was never one to be on the receiving end of such compliments. "Why, thank you, sir. I myself wasn't sure if I had found the correct selection as well." She struggled to push the words out of her mouth, for the sheer improperness of them, the redness of her cheeks brightening with each sentence given. The musicians began to play some odd-sounding tunes from an unmentioned country. The loudness of the beats drowned out any simple conversation and drew people onto the ballroom floor instead. Ethel began to shake at the thought of being invited to join the crowd of dancers, not wanting to embarrass herself with the first man she's met tonight. He turned to her and drew himself close so that she could hear his words. She could feel his breath stroking her cheeks as the words played into her ears. "Would you mind if we went somewhere to continue our conversation in quiet?" His voice was so soothing that even when being drowned by the noise of clashing instruments, it began to calm her. "I'm unsure where we could even go to escape the beauty of this movement," she attempted to joke, more for herself than to entertain him. "I have a carriage outside." He turned and waved his hands towards the windows. "I believe the walls may just be thick enough for us to carry on, undisturbed." She nodded in agreement and followed his steps outside. She watched as he glided through the room, ever gracefully. Even though she was unfamiliar with the man, someone was finally taking notice of her. They entered the chill of the night air, and finally were relieved of the music as the doors shut behind them. Her face was stung by the cold, however it was offset by the heat of her blushing cheeks. They began to walk slowly towards the carriages, now that they could carry the conversation uninterrupted. Ethel tried her best to walk as expertly as she possibly could muster in these heels. "Pardon my forwardness. I know it seems awkward to have only really said hello before asking you to my carriage, but for some odd reason, I feel I can trust you." He scoffed as he looked inwards to the dancing nobles. She was curious as to the meaning of his words. As if he could feel her stare, he turned back. "I apologize. It's just odd. I feel more open with you than any other noblewoman I've ever met." She felt a tinge of guilt for hiding behind the dress and jewelry she wore. Her face almost began feeling numb with the amounts of emotions she was experiencing. Perhaps this man would be understanding now with the way he was speaking towards her. She felt a wave of courage as she began. "I must admit, there may be a misunderstanding with who you think I am." The look on his face made her immediately regret having said anything. "What do you mean?" he asked emphatically, his eyes intent on her demeanor. "I am not noble, but a maid in a noblewoman's house." She checked for any anger, but he still showed curiosity, allowing her to continue speaking freely. "My lady borrowed me this dress and these terrible shoes so that I may come and make something of myself tonight. I apologize for any time I may have caused you to lose." She lowered her head in self-defeat as she began to walk away solemnly. He reached out and gripped her wrist in a strong hold to keep her from leaving. "You're perfect." The words caught her as an odd response. She, however, felt relief in the fact that he didn't want her to leave, until, that is, his grip seemed to tighten to a painful strength. "Excuse me, but you're rather strong and you're hurting my wrist." She attempted to politely remove her wrist from his hand, but he held strong and motionless, his expression changing to a serious tone. His stance was rigid, devoid of any character he had shown previously. She tried to pry herself away, but she was halted by the man's abrupt movement toward the carriages. He pulled her along, strength unwavering. Her feet struggled to find a footing to help her pull away as she beat at the man's hand with her free arm. The impact of her strikes upon his arm felt as if she was beating upon an iron bar. She began to claw at him in a desperate act of self-preservation. Her heart sank with each step that he made, dreading to realize he was attempting to take her away. Her clawing caught the fabric of the man's sleeve, and with a tug she ripped it away from the seam that held it to the rest of the suit. His arm gleamed by the light of the moon, and shone a series of intricate metal pieces that reminded her of the insides of the grandfather clock. The frightful thought of a mechanical man taking her away forced a scream to escape her throat. She didn't know what to do otherwise. This had never happened to her before, and she couldn't think of it ever having happened to anyone else. She turned towards the window and threw her voice as loud as she could to any of the moving bodies inside that might be willing to save her. The music kept the people preoccupied and unaware of the event happening outside. She looked back in fright at the man to see his face now looking towards her with an angry stare. He seemed to be aggressively offended by the sounds she was making, and with a jerk of his arm, she felt a needle pierce the skin on the wrist he was gripping. Ethel attempted again to damage the man's hold, but with each strike she felt her strength slowly dissipate. Her arms began to feel heavy, and her legs began to give way. Her mind started to waver, and she could no longer form any coherent thought. All she could do was just experience everything happening to her. Her body fell limp as the clockwork monster, disguised as a man, caught her collapsing form. He lifted her up without effort and walked her to a small carriage. He reached out, easily keeping her up with one arm, and pulled the door open. Ethel's vision faded slightly, and the clanging sounds of the carriage were nothing but echoes in what felt like her empty skull. The man laid her down in the carriage and shut the door. He then reached to the side and pulled another handle on the side of the vehicle downward. Ethel struggled to keep her eyes open, her body numb of any feeling besides the chill of the night. That chill began to grow, and as she looked around, she could make out the walls of the thing she was lying in were beginning to frost over. Her clouded mind tried to rationalize what would be happening to her in this small space. Was she being taken to be buried in this tight wooden prison, as if she was in a coffin? Or was she to be stored away as if she was meat to be hung up upon a hook? She noticed the short puffs of hot breath releasing from her mouth before the rest of the space within the carriage filled with a similar color. It was as if a snowstorm began within the vehicle, blotting out what remained of her vision, and the cold finalizing the sensation of numbness in her limbs. Her chest heaved for a decent breath, but she could feel herself struggling to keep the pace. Eventually, her sight went black, and her mind went dark. In a moment of near total unconsciousness, she could make out the sound of a voice echoing through her ears. It took a brief moment before she could make out its meaning. She then gave into the darkness, her consciousness fading into the black. In a small moment of respite, she heard these words echo, "We'll start at 1,000,000 units. Do I hear 2?
This podcast has been brought to you by our most wonderful, faithful supporters, my dear wife, Anna Brown.
And my dear wife, Joanna Lusk-Smith.
Without them, we couldn't do this. They are our inspiration. They are everything.
Yes. Joanna helped me form Eternity Found, make it even deeper and more personal to me, and find the tone that I wanted it to be. I couldn't do this without her.
And a couple years back, I suffered a brain injury that severely inhibited my typing abilities. And Anna acts as my scribe and confidant and sounding board, everything. So she's just the best. So thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.